Black Hollow sat buried beneath winter in silence, a mining town built into the bones of the hills. The days were black with soot, and the nights were white with frost. Wind scraped across the rooftops like it was searching for something it had lost, and maybe it was. They said the town was small, but it carried a grief large enough to fill every shadow, to echo in the space between heartbeats. At the very edge of all that quiet sadness lived a man named Jonas Whitlock. He was a miner, a widower, and for all intents and purposes, a ghost who still walked the earth. He wasn't always this way. You have to understand that. Once, he was a husband to a woman named Eliza, whose laugh sounded like wind chimes in a summer breeze. He was a father to a boy named Caleb, who chased fireflies with sticky fingers and eyes as wide as the moon. He had a life. He had a reason. Then, like a thief in the night, the fever took Eliza. It was quick, it was cruel, and it left a hole in him that nothing could fill. For Caleb's safety, he sent the boy to the Westmoreland orphanage, a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary. But sanctuaries can burn. And that one did. A fire, they said, consumed the whole building, took everyone inside with it. The county sent a letter. 2 words stamped in stark black ink. Presumed dead. Just 2 words. They left him with nothing to bury but too much to remember. After that, Jonas stopped speaking. He stopped speaking to the town. He stopped speaking to himself. The silence became his only companion. Each morning, he'd rise in the suffocating dark, chew on a piece of cold bread, and step into the mine. It was like he was begging the mountain to finish the job, to just swallow him whole and get it over with. Each night, he'd come home to a cottage that smelled of cold stone and old wood ash. It was a tomb. Under his bed, tucked away in the darkness, was a small rocking horse. He'd carved it himself from a solid piece of oak. It was worn smooth in all the places where Caleb's tiny hands had gripped it tight. He never moved it. He couldn't bring himself to touch it, but he couldn't bring himself to get rid of it either. On some nights, when the wind howled just right, he'd sit in his chair in the pitch-black room and swear he could hear Caleb's laugh tumbling down the chimney, just for a moment. Just long enough to break him all over again. That night, the night everything began to unravel, started like any other. Jonas stumbled out of the mill saloon with dried blood on his knuckles. Someone had said the wrong name, or maybe the right one. He didn't remember. He just remembered the look in the man's eyes, that pitying stare that made his blood boil. "Ain't your place to look at me that way?" he muttered to the wind as he walked, the moon hanging low and mean in the sky. Snow crunched under his boots, the only sound in a dead world. He reached his cottage, a black shape against the snow, and stepped inside without lighting the lamp. The darkness welcomed him like an old friend. He slumped into his chair, ready for another night of nothing. And then came the knock. 3 times. Not loud, not desperate. Just there. He ignored it. It was probably just the wind or a branch tapping against the wood. But then a voice cut through the silence, muffled by the door. "Jonas, it's Reverend Breyer. I wouldn't come if I had anywhere else to take her." Jonas didn't move for a long moment. The Reverend. What could he possibly want at this hour? With a groan, he heaved himself out of the chair and pulled the door open just a crack. The cold air rushed in, biting at his skin. The Reverend stood there, his coat dusted with fresh snow, his face grim. But it wasn't the Reverend that held Jonas's attention. It was the woman standing beside him. She looked like she'd been worn down by the road, her coat too thin for the vicious cold. But her eyes were steady. They met his without flinching. Her gloved hands were clenched white around the handle of a small, worn leather satchel. It was the only thing she seemed to possess in the world. "This is Miss Evelyn Moore," the Reverend said, his voice low. "She came in on the morning train. Her purse was stolen somewhere between stops. She's got no money, nowhere to sleep. The boarding house turned her out." He paused, letting the silence hang between them. "My sister's family is still visiting from out east. Every bed is full." Jonas stared, his face a mask of stone. "You brought her here," he said. It wasn't a question. The Reverend nodded, not looking away. "Because you understand loss, Jonas. And because she doesn't deserve to freeze." Jonas's gaze shifted back to the woman, Evelyn. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She simply held his stare and said, her voice quiet but clear, "I can sleep by the fire. I won't be in your way." For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Jonas, the Reverend, the woman, the falling snow. He could have slammed the door, he should have. But he didn't. He stepped aside. "Fire's out," he muttered. "Wood stacked in the corner." She gave a single sharp nod. "Thank you." And with that, Evelyn Moore stepped over his threshold, bringing with her a world of trouble he couldn't yet imagine. She moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. Without a word, she knelt by the cold hearth, laid the kindling and logs with practiced hands, and struck a single match. The flame caught, and soon a small, hungry fire began to stretch its arms across the floor, pushing back the oppressive cold. She didn't speak again. She didn't unpack anything more than a thick book and a threadbare blanket from that little leather satchel. She sat on the floor, wrapped herself in the blanket, and began to read, her lips moving silently with the words on the page. Jonas sank back into his chair on the other side of the room and just watched the flames curl and dance. He watched the way the firelight caught the lines on her face. He didn't know what to think, what to feel. He hadn't felt much of anything in 3 years. But as he sat there, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft, almost inaudible sound of another person breathing under his roof, something inside him shifted. It wasn't hope. It was just different. For the first time in 1,000 nights, the house didn't feel quite so empty. Not lovers, not family, just 2 strangers, 2 broken souls, waiting for the ice to thaw. Morning slid into the room like smoke, slow and quiet, unsure if it should stay. The fire Evelyn had lit was still smoldering, a bed of glowing red embers that held the worst of the night's chill at bay. Jonas woke up stiff and sore in his chair, the familiar ache in his back sharpened by the awkward angle he'd slept in. But there was something else. A warmth across his lap. He looked down and saw a blanket, the one she'd been using carefully tucked around him. He didn't remember her doing it. From the small kitchen area came the quiet clink of a pot, followed by a smell that jolted him awake more than the cold ever could. Coffee. Real coffee. Strong and earthy. He pushed himself to his feet and found her there, already moving about the space as if she'd lived there for years. Her sleeves were rolled up, and she was pouring the dark, steaming liquid into a tin cup with a steady hand. "I found the beans by the stove," she said, without turning around. "Hope you don't mind." Jonas just grunted. He took the cup she offered, the heat of it seeping into his cold hands. He took a long sip. It was better than any coffee he'd had in years, better than the watery swill they served at the saloon. They sat in silence, him in his chair, her on the floor by the hearth. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence he was used to. This was different. It was a silence that didn't ask for words, a quiet space that let them both exist without expectation. It was a silence that was, for the first time, not entirely lonely. He didn't know what to make of her. She was a puzzle, a stray cat who had wandered in from the storm, and he didn't have the energy to figure her out. Or so he told himself. Later that morning, Jonas left for the mine. His boots felt heavier than usual, his steps slower. It wasn't the cold or the exhaustion. It was the quiet she had left in his mind, the memory of another person in his house. The thought of it followed him down into the darkness of the earth. At work, the air was thick with more than just coal dust. It was thick with questions. The other miners didn't say much to his face, but he could feel their glances, their whispered conversations that stopped the moment he got near. Black Hollow was a town that fed on gossip, and he had just served them a feast. By the time he trudged home, dusk painting the snow in shades of purple and gray, he was expecting to find the house as he'd left it, cold and empty. But it wasn't. The floor was swept. His muddy boots had been cleaned and set by the door. His coat was hanging straight on its peg, and the smell of warm bread was rising from the hearth. Evelyn didn't say anything when he stepped through the door. She just gave him a small nod and then returned to her work, stitching a tear in the sleeve of his work shirt. He stood there for a moment, watching the nimble movement of her fingers, the concentration on her face. A part of him, a part he thought had died with Eliza, felt a strange twinge of something. "Don't have to do that," he said, his voice rough. She didn't look up from her sewing. "I know," she replied simply, and that was that. But it wasn't. Because later that night, the Reverend came by again, twisting his hat in his hands, his words clumsy and apologetic. "My sister's family, they're still under our roof," he stammered, "and I haven't heard back from the school in Brooksville. No position for Miss Moore yet. And, well, the boarding house, they still won't take her." Jonas just stood there, saying nothing. The Reverend looked toward the fire, then back at Jonas, his expression pained. He finally said what Jonas had already heard in the whispers at the mine. "People are starting to talk, Jonas." Jonas just nodded once. That was all the confirmation the Reverend needed. He left soon after, leaving the two of them alone with the unspoken tension. It was Evelyn who finally broke the silence. She was sitting by the table, her sewing laid aside. She waited until Jonas had settled into his chair before she spoke, her voice even and calm, but with an undercurrent of something he couldn't quite place. "We should talk," she said. He stopped, his hand halfway to the fire. "I know this isn't what either of us asked for," she began, keeping her voice level. "But I am a woman with no wages and no name in a town that doesn't take kindly to that combination." She finally set down the cloth she was mending and met his eyes directly. The firelight flickered in their depths. "I'm not asking for your charity, Jonas. I'm proposing an arrangement." Jonas said nothing, his face unreadable. Her next words hung in the air, sharp and clear and utterly insane. "A marriage," she said. "Legal, simple, no expectations beyond what we agreed to. You'd have a house kept, meals cooked. I'd have a roof over my head and a name. It'll settle the whispers for good." She waited, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though he thought he could see a slight tremor in them. Jonas just sat there, staring at the fire, the crackling flames the only sound in the room. He thought of the whispers. He thought of the pitying looks. He thought of the suffocating loneliness. Then, after a long moment that stretched into an eternity, he looked at her, and he said, "We'll see the Reverend in the morning." Evelyn nodded once. No smile, no visible relief. Just a quiet acceptance. And in that moment, the silence between them shifted again. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the quiet, held breath just before the storm breaks. They were married the next day. There was no music, no flowers, no guests besides the Reverend and his wife. Just the weak winter light filtering through the lace curtains of the Reverend's parlor and the quiet crackle of the fire in the hearth. It felt less like a wedding and more like a business transaction. Jonas stood straight and tall in a coat that was a little too tight in the shoulders, a relic from a life he no longer recognized. His hands were scrubbed clean, but the coal dust was ground so deep into the lines of his skin that it would never truly wash away. Evelyn wore the same plain gray dress she'd arrived in, though she'd ironed it so it was crisp and neat. It was buttoned all the way to her collar, her sleeves cuffed precisely. As they stood before the Reverend, she reached out and, with a startlingly intimate gesture, fixed the fold in his lapel. "That'll do," she murmured, so softly he barely heard it. Reverend Breyer's voice filled the quiet room, the familiar words of Scripture feeling foreign and strange in this context. He read the vows with the slow, solemn cadence of a man who knew that neither party expected anything more than the legal protection the words provided. Jonas answered first, his voice a low rumble. "Yes." Then it was Evelyn's turn. She looked not at Jonas, but at the window, at the snow-covered world outside. "I do," she said, her voice clear and steady. There were no smiles, no trembling hands. When the Reverend gently asked about a ring, the room fell silent. Everyone assumed there wasn't one, but Jonas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a simple, thin gold band. It had belonged to his mother, and then to Eliza. He hadn't looked at it in 3 years. He took Evelyn's left hand. Her fingers were cold, but they didn't shake. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a little loose. She blinked twice, a quick, almost imperceptible motion, before letting her hand fall back to her side. And just like that, they were husband and wife. The Reverend closed his book with a quiet snap. His wife offered them warm cider in tin cups, which neither of them touched. The whole thing was over in less than 10 minutes. The walk home was slow, their boots cracking through the thin layer of ice that had formed over the snow. Their shoulders nearly brushed as they walked, but never quite touched. He could feel the eyes on them. People watched from their porches, from behind twitching curtains, their breath fogging the glass. Some offered small, hesitant nods. Others just whispered, their words snatched away by the wind. Evelyn spoke first, her voice a low murmur. "It'll pass. They'll find someone else to stare at soon enough." Jonas just grunted in reply. "They always do." When they reached the cottage, he opened the door and held it for her, a gesture of politeness that felt strangely formal. She stepped inside and looked around the small room, as if seeing it for the first time, as if the short ceremony had somehow changed the very walls of the place. She didn't speak. He removed his coat and hung it on the peg. She did the same. They didn't talk about the vows. They didn't talk about the ring. They didn't talk about anything at all. That night, she moved her things into the small, cold back bedroom, the one with the crooked window that looked out at the skeletal trees. Jonas stayed in the front room, sleeping in his chair by the fire. A husband and a wife, sleeping in separate rooms, a house between them. The arrangement had begun. But as he drifted off to sleep, the unfamiliar weight of another person's presence in the house settled over him, and he had the unsettling feeling that this was not an ending, but the beginning of something far more complicated than he could ever have imagined. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Morning would come with a fresh blanket of snow, and when Jonas came out to the main room, there would be 2 cups of coffee waiting instead of 1. A silent acknowledgement of their new reality. It was a life built on routine, on unspoken agreements. She cooked. He chopped the wood. She mended a ripped curtain. He fixed a loose floorboard in the kitchen without being asked. They moved around each other in the small space of the cottage like 2 dancers who had never rehearsed but somehow knew the steps. They were partners in a strange, silent play. There was no affection, no real conversation, but there was a deep, abiding respect, a shared understanding. They were 2 survivors, clinging to the same piece of wreckage. One evening, he came home from the mine to find she had left a book open on the small table by the fire. It was a story about a boy who wandered the world, lost, and a father who never stopped waiting for him to come home. Jonas stood there for a long time, staring at the page. He didn't say a word about it. He didn't have to. But he didn't close the book either. He left it there, open, a silent testament to the grief that still lived in the house with them. In time, the silence between them began to change. It was no longer the heavy, empty silence of his grief. It no longer felt like an absence. It felt like space, space being made for something new, something that neither of them had a name for yet. February rolled in like a ghost, quiet and heavy. The cold wasn't just in the air anymore. It had settled deep into the bones of the town, into the very walls of the cottage. It made everything brittle, the windows, the trees, even the people. The mines groaned under the constant pressure of the freeze and thaw cycle, and so did the men who worked them. Jonas pushed himself harder than anyone. He took longer hours, spoke even fewer words. He poured all his energy, all his pain, into the rock and the coal, hoping to leave it all buried deep in the earth. But Evelyn noticed. She saw things he thought he was hiding. She saw the way he sat for a long moment before putting on his boots in the morning, gathering his strength. She saw the way he winced when he lifted the heavy coal bucket. She saw how his right hand would sometimes tremble just slightly when he thought she wasn't looking. She didn't pry. She just watched. One night, as she was clearing the supper dishes, she finally asked, "Are you hurt?" He didn't look up from the fire. "Just tired," he said, his voice flat. It was a dismissal, a wall thrown up between them. Evelyn didn't press him, but he saw the way she folded the dishcloth, slower than usual, her movements deliberate and thoughtful. She knew he was lying, and he knew that she knew. The unspoken truth hung in the air between them, another secret in a house full of them. The very next week, it happened. One moment, the mine shaft was solid, the familiar groans and creaks of wood and stone the only sounds. The next, there was a sound like thunder, like the mountain itself was cracking in half. Jonas didn't remember much after the initial collapse. Just the terrifying sound of timber snapping like twigs, of stone and earth sliding and roaring down around him. Someone was screaming. Maybe it was him. Then darkness. When they pulled him out of the wreckage, he wasn't awake. His body was a broken mess. Ribs cracked, shoulder dislocated, a deep gash above his brow that had crusted over with dried blood and coal dust. The foreman sent word to the town, and it was the Reverend who helped carry him home, a limp and broken man. Evelyn must have been watching from the window because she opened the door before they even had a chance to knock. Her face was pale, but her expression was resolute. There were no tears, no hysterics. She simply made space on the bed in the main room, took the clean cloths they offered, and stoked the stove until the cottage pulsed with a desperate heat. The town doctor came, a weary man who smelled of whiskey and carbolic soap. He poked and prodded at Jonas, shook his head, and said that he would live if he wanted to. It was up to him now. After the doctor left, Evelyn sat in a chair by the bed, her hands folded in her lap, and began her vigil. Jonas drifted in and out of consciousness, lost in a fevered haze. He murmured names in his delirium. Once, in a moment of clarity, his eyes fluttered open, and he whispered a single word. "Eliza." Evelyn, sitting beside him, closed her eyes for just a second. A flicker of pain crossed her face, so quick he might have imagined it. Then she opened them again, her gaze steady. She leaned in close, her voice a soft anchor in his sea of pain. "I'm still here, Jonas," she said. "You're not alone." Days bled into one another. She was a constant presence. She fed him broth by the spoonful. She changed his bandages with gentle, efficient hands. She sponged the fever sweat from his forehead. She was a quiet guardian, a silent protector. When his eyes finally stayed open long enough for him to speak, his voice was a raw, scratchy rasp. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes. "You stayed," he whispered. She nodded, a small, simple movement. "Where else would I go?" He studied her face, trying to understand. "You could have walked away," he said. "No one would have blamed you." She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something vulnerable in her eyes. "I could have," she agreed. "But you didn't," he pressed, needing to understand. "No," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I didn't." Later that week, as he was propped up with pillows near the fire, his body aching but his mind clear, she did something that shattered the quiet peace between them. She walked to his old bedroom, the one that had been Caleb's, and came back with the little wooden rocking horse. She laid it gently in his lap. The smooth, worn wood felt heavy, impossibly heavy. He held it for a long, long time, his fingers tracing the familiar curves he had carved so many years ago. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. But she saw it all in the tight clench of his jaw, in the soft, uncontrollable tremble in his hand. The grief was still there, a living thing inside him. But as he looked up at her, at this strange, quiet woman who had refused to leave his side, he realized something else was there, too. Something new. Something just beginning to grow in the ruins of his life. Jonas healed slowly. It was the kind of slow that forces a man to confront his own fragility, to understand how easily a life can be broken. He could stand, shakily, by the third week. He could walk with a pronounced limp by the fourth. But there were things that had been broken in that mine shaft that took longer to mend than bones. He hated needing help. He was a man who had always prided himself on his strength, his self-reliance. But Evelyn gave him the help he needed without a trace of pity, just quiet hands and a steady voice. She was always just a step away when he faltered, never closer than he needed, but never farther than he could reach. She had an uncanny sense of what he needed before he did. One evening, she was helping him from his bed to the chair by the fire. As she was placing the blanket over his legs, her hand brushed against his. He caught her wrist, his grip gentle but firm. She froze. "You don't have to do all this," he said, his voice low. She looked down at his hand holding hers, then back up at his face. "I know," she replied softly. He held her wrist for a moment longer, a silent communication passing between them, and then he let go. The long, quiet days found a new rhythm. With Jonas unable to work, the cottage became their entire world. In the evenings, to pass the time, she would read aloud to him. Passages from old novels she'd found on a dusty shelf, short stories from magazines a neighbor had left on their porch. Her voice was calm and clear, and it filled the small cottage like a song that didn't need any music. It smoothed over the rough edges of his pain, and for a few hours each night, he could almost forget the darkness of the mine, the darkness in his own soul. One night she was reading a story and she paused on a particular line. "Some fires burn fast," she read, "and are gone in an instant. Others stay, embers in the cold, just long enough to keep you from freezing." She looked up from the book. He didn't say anything, but when she closed the cover for the night, she found him still watching her, his expression thoughtful and intense. He started to talk about Caleb, not all at once, but in small, broken pieces. He'd tell her about the way the boy laughed, a high, clear sound, when he rode the little wooden horse Jonas had carved. He told her how Caleb loved sweetbread with extra cinnamon, and how he was terrified of thunderstorms. He would tell these stories to the fire, not looking at her, but he knew she was listening. And Evelyn, she listened to every word. She absorbed his grief, his memories, and she held them for him. She listened, and she held a secret that was growing heavier with each passing day. A secret that felt like a betrayal, because she already knew the truth. Or at least, she suspected it. She had known for weeks, since before the mine collapse. A letter had come, addressed to the Reverend, but passed on to her. It was from an orphanage in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It was folded neatly, the paper crisp and official. It spoke of a boy, around 10 years old, found wandering near the railroad tracks 2 years prior. No memory of his name, of where he came from. But he had a distinctive birthmark, a small crescent shape, just behind his right ear, and sometimes, the letter said, he would wake up in the middle of the night screaming a single name, a name that made Evelyn's blood run cold. The name was Jonas. She had meant to tell him. That was the honest truth. She had written the initial letter to the orphanage herself, using a false name, acting on a sliver of information she'd overheard at the general store about the Westmoreland fire survivors being sent to Harrisburg. It was a whim, a shot in the dark. She was just trying to help. She hadn't expected a response. But when the letter came back, when she read the details about the birthmark, the nightmares, when she realized that this boy could be Caleb, she had frozen. She told herself she needed to be sure first. She told herself she was protecting Jonas from a false hope that would shatter him completely. But as the nights went on, as she sat by his bedside, listening to his fevered murmurs, her noble resolve began to rot into a bitter guilt. One night, she had pulled the letter from its hiding place in the lining of her satchel. She held it over the flames of the hearth, so close the edges began to curl from the heat. She almost burned it. She almost let the secret turn to ash. But she couldn't. She pulled it back at the last second and hid it away again. A secret too heavy for the truth. A poison she was too cowardly to administer. And so, when Jonas looked at the fire and said softly, his voice thick with a pain that never faded, "Sometimes, I think he's still out there somewhere." She had looked at the flames and whispered, "Sometimes, I think you're right." But she didn't say more. Not yet. She couldn't find the words. She was waiting for a sign, for the right moment. But she was starting to realize there was no right moment for a revelation that could either save a man or destroy him completely. It was a quiet morning when it all finally came undone. The kind of morning where the frost on the window panes looked like intricate lace, and the fire in the hearth didn't crackle, it just whispered, an illusion of peace. Evelyn had been staring at the same page in her book for nearly 10 minutes, her eyes scanning the words but her mind a million miles away. Jonas was at the table, his hand steady again, his shoulder finally able to hold weight. He was carving a new handle for a shovel, the sharp, rhythmic scrape of the knife on wood the only sound in the room. But his mind was elsewhere, too. They were both adrift in their own private seas of thought. Then, as if a string inside her had finally snapped, she stood up. She walked to the small chest of drawers where she kept her few belongings and pulled out the letter. Her fingers shook as she held it. This was it. There was no turning back. "Jonas," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a blade. He looked up from his carving, his eyes questioning. "There's something I should have told you weeks ago," she said, her voice trembling now. "And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to hear it." She walked to the table and set the letter down in front of him. The seal was already broken. "I wrote to an orphanage, in Harrisburg. I did it before the mine collapsed, before anything changed between us." He said nothing. He just stared at the letter as if it were a venomous snake. "I asked about your son," she continued, forcing the words out. "I didn't use your name. I gave them details. His age, the birthmark you mentioned once." Her voice hitched. "I wasn't expecting anything to come of it. It was a foolish hope." Jonas's eyes were locked on the envelope. His knuckles were white where he gripped the wooden handle of the half-finished carving. "They wrote back," Evelyn whispered, her throat tight. "They said a couple took in a boy after the Westmoreland fire, a boy with no memory of his name. But he has the mark, Jonas. A crescent shape, just behind his right ear." Jonas's breath caught in his throat. It was a ragged, painful sound. He finally looked up at her, and his eyes were dark with a storm of emotions she couldn't read. Betrayal, hope, rage. "You knew," he said. His voice was rough, cold as a tombstone. "You knew all this time." "I did," Evelyn said, tears finally welling in her eyes. "But I was afraid. I was so afraid of giving you false hope, of breaking you all over again if it wasn't him." He stood up slowly, the chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. The sound was violent in the quiet room. "You should have told me," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I know," she sobbed. "Why are you telling me now?" he demanded. "Because if there is even a 1 in a million chance that boy is Caleb," she said, meeting his furious gaze, "you deserve to find him. You deserve to know." Jonas looked from her tear-streaked face down to the letter on the table. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the corner of the envelope. And then he looked back at her, and for the first time in 3 long years, he didn't look angry. He didn't look broken. He just looked lost. He pressed a hand flat on the table as if to steady himself against a world that had just tilted on its axis. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "A farm," she said, her own voice shaky with relief. "Outside a town called Willow Bend, in Ohio." He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Then we leave tomorrow." Evelyn blinked, stunned by the speed of it. "Just like that?" "Just like that," he said, his voice stronger now, filled with a purpose she hadn't heard before. "If there's a chance, any chance at all, that he's my boy." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I'll come with you," she said. He looked at her for a long, searching moment, and then he gave a single nod. They packed that evening, not speaking much, the air thick with unspoken emotions. But something fundamental had shifted between them. The fragile structure they had built was not broken. It had melted, reforming into something new, something stronger. Hope had entered the house, and it was terrifying. The road to Willow Bend cut through silent, thawing hills. They traveled by a rented wagon, the wheels sinking into the slush and mud of the late winter thaw. The sky stayed a persistent, weary gray, but for the first time it didn't feel oppressive. Jonas didn't speak much on the journey, his hands tight on the reins, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as if he could will the destination to appear sooner. Evelyn sat beside him, glancing from the hand-drawn map to his stoic profile. She saw the tension in his jaw, the desperate hope warring with a lifetime of grief in his eyes. She had gambled everything on the contents of that letter. She had risked the fragile peace they had built, risked his trust. Now all they could do was ride toward the answer. 3 long days later, they arrived. The farm was a modest place, the barn and farmhouse weather-worn but sturdy, alive. A plume of smoke curled from the chimney, a welcoming sign. A dog barked once from the porch, then fell silent, and then they saw him. A boy was out front, near a woodpile, splitting kindling. He was thin, and his feet were bare despite the cold ground. He was too small for the axe he was swinging, but he handled it with a clean, practiced motion. Jonas pulled the wagon to a halt at the edge of the property. He just stared, his breath catching in his chest. Evelyn placed a gentle hand on his arm. "That's him, isn't it?" she whispered. Jonas shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he breathed, "but I feel it. Deep in my bones, I feel it." They climbed down from the wagon, their legs stiff from the long journey. Jonas hung back, his feet rooted to the spot, while Evelyn walked slowly toward the farmhouse door. An older woman answered, her hair streaked with silver, her eyes lined with the maps of a long and not always easy life, but they were kind eyes. Evelyn explained, in a low, calm voice, who they were and why they had come. She didn't mention the fire, didn't want to spook them. She just spoke of a lost boy and a heartbroken father. The woman listened patiently, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped aside. "He goes by Will now," she said, her voice soft. "My husband found him near the train tracks outside Harrisburg 2 winters ago, said he didn't know his name, where he came from, no memory at all." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the boy by the woodpile. "He has nightmares, though, awful ones, and he has a mark." Evelyn looked back at Jonas, and he took that as his cue. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward the boy. The rhythmic chop of the axe stopped. The boy turned, his eyes wide and wary like a startled deer. Jonas crouched down in the dirt, bringing himself to the boy's level. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it might break them. "Hey," Jonas said, his voice barely above a whisper. I used to carve horses, just like that one you have tucked in your belt." The boy's eyes flicked down to the small, crudely carved horse at his waist, then back up to the stranger's face. "I like carving," the boy said quietly. "Don't know where I learned how." Jonas nodded slowly, his eyes drinking in every detail of the boy's face. It was thinner, older, but it was the face from his memories. He reached out a trembling hand and gently tucked a stray curl of brown hair behind the boy's right ear. And there it was, faint, but unmistakable. A small, perfect crescent moon. Jonas blinked hard, trying to fight back the wave of emotion that threatened to drown him. He swallowed once, his throat thick. "Caleb?" he whispered. The boy just stared at him. His small face was a canvas of confusion, fear, and then something else, a flicker, a tiny spark of recognition deep in his eyes. Hope. All of it was tangled together in that one long look. And then his lips parted. He said a single word, a word that Jonas had only ever heard in his dreams, in the cruel whispers of the wind. "Papa?" The world stopped. For Jonas, everything fell away. The farm, the cold, Evelyn watching from the porch. All of it disappeared. A sound escaped his throat, something between a sob and a prayer. He lunged forward and pulled the boy into his arms, holding him with a desperate strength, burying his face in the boy's hair. He was real. He was warm. He was alive. It was like he had been drowning for 3 long years, and he had finally reached the shore. The boy, Caleb, clung to him without question, his small arms wrapping around Jonas's neck, as if he, too, had finally found something he hadn't even known he was searching for. From the porch, Evelyn watched, one hand pressed to her chest, the other wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. She smiled, a small, shaky, beautiful smile. It was the smile of someone who had been holding their breath for a very long time, and had finally let it go. As Jonas knelt in the dirt, his arms wrapped around his son, he looked back at her. And in his eyes, she saw more than just gratitude. She saw the beginning of something real. The beginning of everything. They returned to Black Hollow 2 days later, a different set of people than the ones who had left. The wagon ride was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Jonas sat with Caleb sleeping against his side, his arm draped protectively around the boy's shoulders. He hadn't let go of him for more than a few minutes since they'd left the farm. It was as if he was afraid the boy might vanish again if he looked away. Evelyn held the reins, guiding the horse through the familiar dreary streets. The town looked smaller somehow, the buildings more crooked and worn, but their little cottage at the edge of it all, it looked different. It looked like a place that had been waiting for them to come home. Inside, the fire was lit again, a warm and welcoming heart in the center of the house. Jonas carried the sleeping Caleb to the back bedroom, the one that had been waiting for him all this time. He laid him down gently on the small bed and brushed the hair from his forehead. "Welcome home, son," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Evelyn watched from the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Later that night, when the house was still and Caleb was sound asleep, Evelyn stepped out onto the small front porch. The air was cold and crisp, the stars sharp and bright in the black sky. She needed a moment to breathe, to process the miracle that had unfolded. A moment later, the door opened and Jonas joined her. They stood side by side in the comfortable silence, looking out at the sleeping town. It was Jonas who broke the silence first. "You saved me, Evelyn," he said, his voice low and serious. She turned to look at him, his profile strong and clear in the moonlight. "You were already halfway back to shore, Jonas," she replied softly. "I just walked with you the rest of the way." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch. "The day you came here," he said, "the day the Reverend brought you to my door, I didn't think I would ever feel anything again. Not joy, not hope, not anything." He took a small step closer. "And now I feel too much." Evelyn swallowed, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. Her own voice came out as a soft whisper. "I never meant to stay, Jonas," she confessed. "I was just passing through, but I don't want to leave." He took another slow step toward her, and then another, until there was no more space between them. The cold night air was the only thing that separated them. "I don't want you to," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she was beginning to recognize. He reached up, his hand calloused and warm from a life of hard work, and gently cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed just beneath her eye, wiping away a tear she didn't know had fallen. "May I?" he asked, his voice a low plea. She couldn't speak. She just nodded once, and then he kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of obligation or of gratitude for finding his son. It was something else entirely. It was slow and real and full of all the unspoken things that had grown between them in the silence, in the firelight, in the shared hurt and the quiet healing. It was the kiss of a man who had come back to life. When they finally pulled apart, she leaned her head against his chest, and he rested his chin on the top of her hair. They stood there for a long while, wrapped in each other's arms, the silence between them now filled with a profound and peaceful joy. Inside, Caleb slept soundly in his own bed for the first time in years. Outside, the wind blew softly through the pines, and in that small, forgotten house at the edge of a forgotten town, a family was being born again. Not by fate, but by choice. Love hadn't come like a flash flood. It had come like the winter snow, quiet, persistent, and deep. It had covered everything, and it had stayed. What do you think happened to Evelyn's lost brother? If you enjoyed this story of hope and second chances, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the shadows.